every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The house on West Volunteer Way was a perfect bubble of pastel pink, a beacon of manufactured cheerfulness in a quiet Springfield, Missouri neighborhood. It had been built by Habitat for Humanity, a gift of communal goodwill for a mother and daughter who had supposedly lost everything in the destructive winds of Hurricane Katrina. From the outside, it was a symbol of hope, complete with a thoughtfully constructed wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. Inside lived Claudine D.D. Blanchard and her daughter, Gypsy Rose. To the world, their story was a testament to the power of a mother's love and a child's resilience in the face of relentless tragedy. Dee was the platonic ideal of a caregiver, tireless, doting, a fierce advocate who navigated a labyrinthine medical system for her profoundly disabled child. Gypsy was the embodiment of innocence trapped in a failing body. She was a diminutive figure, always seen in a wheelchair, with large glasses framing her pale face, a feeding tube often visible beneath her clothes, and a high-pitched, childlike voice that completed the picture of arrested development. Gypsy's list of ailments, as curated and recited by her mother with practiced solemnity, was a catastrophic medical encyclopedia: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, severe asthma, sleep apnea, vision and hearing impairments, and an unspecified chromosomal defect. Dee would explain to neighbors, doctors, and journalists that her daughter had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. Her teeth had rotted out and been painfully removed, a supposed side effect of her many medications and poor saliva production, a condition which itself had allegedly necessitated the surgical removal of her salivary glands. She was fed a nutritional supplement called Pediasure through a tube surgically inserted into her stomach because she couldn't swallow properly. She couldn't walk. She couldn't eat solid food. She couldn't be left alone. She was a fragile doll, and Dee was her constant, vigilant protector. Their life was a carefully documented parade of hospital visits, charity events, and sponsored trips to Disney World and concerts. They were local celebrities, the subjects of heartwarming news stories, the grateful recipients of an endless outpouring of sympathy, charity, and financial support. But on June 14, 2015, this meticulously constructed reality was shattered by a few lines of text on a shared Facebook profile, an account named D.Gyp Blanchard. The first post, appearing in the early afternoon, was crude and shocking. "That bitch is dead." Friends and neighbors were confused, horrified. They assumed, hoped, that the account had been hacked. Who could write such a thing about the beloved Dee? But then, in the comment thread below, a second, more terrifying message appeared in response to concerned inquiries. It was a graphic description of a violent murder, claiming the victim had been raped, and her sweet innocent daughter had been violated as well, her screams unheard. Panic erupted online. Friends who lived nearby, like Kim Blanchard, no relation, and her husband David, rushed to the little pink house. They knocked, they called, but there was no answer. The family car, a silver Dodge Neon, was still in the driveway. Gypsy's familiar wheelchair was still on the ramp. Fearing the worst, they called 911. When Greene County Sheriff's deputies arrived and forced their way inside, they found a scene of eerie stillness. The house was immaculate, almost sterile, filled to the brim with stuffed animals, Disney princess memorabilia, and an arsenal of medical equipment. In the back bedroom, they found Dee Blanchard. She was lying face down on her bed in a pool of blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the back, an attack of brutal personal violence. Of Gypsy Rose, the frail, helpless girl who supposedly couldn't survive a single day without her mother. There was no sign. The immediate assumption was a horrifying one. A home invasion had turned deadly, and a profoundly disabled child had been abducted by her mother's killer. A statewide alert was issued for a missing, endangered person. The community held its breath, praying for the safe return of the little girl in the wheelchair. But as investigators began to peel back the layers of the Blanchard's life, they found that nothing was as it seemed. The truth was not in the medical charts or the news clippings, but hidden in the very foundation of that pink house, a foundation built not on love, but on a monstrous, decades-long deception. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a lie so profound it could only be severed by a blade in the night. This is the anatomy of Munchausen by proxy. To understand the crime, we must first understand the architect of the prison, D.D. Blanchard. Born Claudine Petra in 1967 in the small bayou town of Chack Bay, Louisiana, she grew up in a large working-class family. From an early age, she exhibited what her family would later describe as a compulsive need for attention and a disturbing talent for manipulation. Relatives recalled her as a difficult child and a troubled young woman with a history of petty crimes like shoplifting and check fraud. Her nephew, Bobby Petra, would later recount how Dee would steal clothing and then brazenly wear it in front of the family members she had stolen it from, denying everything, even when confronted with undeniable proof. This pattern of casual, confident deception was a hallmark of her personality long before Gypsy was born. There were darker whispers, too, stories that only took on their full, horrifying significance in hindsight. Dee's own mother, Emma Petra, withered away from a long illness, and some family members later came to believe that Dee had systematically starved her. After Emma's death, Dee's father remarried a woman named Laura. Laura and Dee had a contentious relationship. Laura began to suffer from a mysterious, debilitating illness that kept her bedridden for 9 agonizing months. She suspected Dee was poisoning her, and her suspicions solidified when she found a container of weed killer that had been moved, and her food began to taste strange. While never proven, the accusation hung in the air, a chilling premonition of Dee's capacity to inflict harm on those she was meant to be caring for, all while maintaining a facade of concern. This was her pattern: to create or exacerbate a crisis around a loved one, and then to place herself at the center of it, the long-suffering, heroic caregiver. In her early 20s, Dee met Rod Blanchard. He was a senior in high school, just 17 years old, while she was 24. She pursued him relentlessly, and he was swept up in a relationship that moved at a dizzying pace. She became pregnant quickly. They married, but the relationship was fragile from the start. Rod has stated that he knew early on that he didn't truly love her, but felt a sense of obligation. By the time their daughter, Gypsy Rose, was born in July of 1991, they were already separated. Rod was present for the birth, and by all initial accounts, Gypsy was a perfectly healthy baby. He recalls his overwhelming love for his new daughter, a beautiful, healthy infant. But the lie did not begin at birth. It began soon after, a small seed of deceit that would grow into a suffocating forest. The fabrication started with a whisper of a diagnosis. When Gypsy was just 3 months old, Dee became convinced she suffered from sleep apnea. She subjected the infant to numerous tests and overnight stays in the hospital. Doctors found nothing definitively wrong, just minor intermittent snoring that was common in babies. But Dee was insistent, a frantic, persuasive mother who seemed utterly convinced of her child's suffering. This was the first brick in the wall of fabricated illness. From there, the diagnoses escalated at a dizzying pace, each one more severe than the last. Dee Dee claimed Gypsy had a chromosomal defect, a vague but serious-sounding condition that she could never precisely name. This was followed by a self-diagnosis of muscular dystrophy, which led to Gypsy's first wheelchair around the age of 7 or 8, despite there being no clinical evidence that she had difficulty walking. The mechanism of this deception was a masterclass in manipulation and medical fraud. Dee Dee had some nursing training, which gave her just enough medical terminology to sound credible to laypeople and even to some doctors. She learned to describe symptoms with textbook precision, often researching conditions ahead of time. Her masterstroke was a strategy of constant motion. She moved from doctor to doctor, from hospital to hospital, across Louisiana, and eventually to Missouri. If a physician started to ask too many questions, failed to find evidence for Gypsy's supposed conditions, or worse, suggested that Gypsy seemed perfectly healthy, Dee Dee would simply pack up and find a new one. She would arrive at a new clinic, a frantic single mother with a file of confusing medical information, claiming that previous records had been lost in a fire or a flood, making her own narrative the only available history. She coached Gypsy on what to say, but more often would not let her speak at all, interrupting to explain that her daughter's cognitive disabilities made her an unreliable historian. During examinations, she would pinch or squeeze Gypsy under a blanket to elicit a yelp of pain at the appropriate moment, confirming a doctor's palpation of a supposedly sore area. She shaved her daughter's head, claiming her hair would only fall out anyway from medication or chemotherapy for a leukemia that was never actually diagnosed by any oncologist. When a muscle biopsy on Gypsy's leg came back negative for muscular dystrophy, Dee Dee was furious, dismissing the results and continuing to insist on the diagnosis. She was a performer, and the doctor's office was her stage. Perhaps the most visceral symbols of the abuse were the feeding tube and the state of Gypsy's teeth. Dee Dee convinced doctors at Tulane University Hospital that Gypsy suffered from severe acid reflux and was failing to thrive, unable to take in enough nutrition orally. A gastrostomy tube, or G-tube, was surgically implanted directly into Gypsy's stomach. To maintain the illusion that Gypsy couldn't swallow properly, Dee Dee would apply a topical anesthetic like Oragel to her daughter's gums, which would numb the area and cause her to drool. This symptom was then presented to doctors as proof of her swallowing difficulties. In reality, Gypsy could eat perfectly well, and sometimes did in secret. The feeding tube led to infections and constant discomfort. The same numbing agent, combined with the sugary Pediasure, fed through her G-tube, and a general neglect of her dental hygiene, caused Gypsy's teeth to decay. Instead of seeking restorative care, Dee Dee had them pulled one by one, until Gypsy was left with only a few rotting stumps. This not only added to the visual picture of a profoundly sick child, but also had a practical effect. It made it harder for Gypsy to eat solid food, further reinforcing her dependence on the feeding tube and her mother. Dee Dee was not just fabricating illnesses. She was actively causing real medical problems to substantiate her lies. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina provided Dee Dee with the perfect opportunity to erase her past and start fresh. Their apartment in Slidell, Louisiana, sustained only minor damage, but Dee Dee claimed it was completely destroyed, casting them as desperate refugees. This narrative allowed her to sever ties with any doctors or family members in Louisiana who might have been growing suspicious. She could now claim that all of Gypsy's medical records had been washed away in the flood, a convenient and tragic explanation that wiped the slate clean. They relocated to Missouri, where the community of Springfield, moved by their story, embraced them with open arms. In 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them the now infamous Pink House. The Make-A-Wish Foundation sent them on multiple trips to Disney World. They received free flights, concert tickets from stars like Miranda Lambert, and thousands of dollars in donations and government benefits. Dee Dee had successfully monetized her daughter's fictional suffering. She was a celebrity in the local disabled community, a pillar of strength and a source of inspiration. She was also, in reality, committing a profound and systematic form of child abuse known as factitious disorder imposed on another, more commonly known as Munchausen by proxy. For most of her life, Gypsy Rose Blanchard knew nothing but the world her mother had created for her. She was a prisoner who did not know she was in a prison. She believed, for many years, that she was sick. She believed she needed the wheelchair, the feeding tube, the endless medications that made her feel lethargic and unwell. Her mother was the source of all information, the sun around which her tiny universe revolved. Dee Dee kept her daughter physically, emotionally, and intellectually isolated. Gypsy was supposedly homeschooled, but her education was deliberately stunted, keeping her dependent and ignorant of the outside world, effectively frozen at the developmental level of a young child. She wasn't allowed to have friends her own age. Her interactions were almost exclusively with her mother and the stream of medical professionals her mother curated. This isolation was a key component of the control. It created a closed loop of information where Dee Dee's word was law, and reality was whatever she declared it to be. Physical control was maintained through constant surveillance. Dee Dee slept in the same bed as Gypsy until she was an adult, used a baby monitor in her room, and sometimes put bells on the doors to know if she moved. When Gypsy misbehaved, the punishment could be physical, with Dee Dee allegedly using her hands or a coat hanger to strike her daughter. But as Gypsy entered her teenage years, and then her early 20s, an age she was only vaguely aware of, as her mother kept changing her birth year to make her seem younger, cracks began to form in the facade. Despite Dee Dee's efforts to infantilize her, Gypsy was growing up. She had the same desires as any other young woman: friendship, independence, and romance. The Internet, which Dee Dee allowed her to use under strict supervision for her schooling, became her secret window to the world her mother had forbidden. Late at night when Dee Dee was asleep, Gypsy would create secret social media profiles on accounts hidden from her mother. She would join online dating sites and Christian singles forums, exploring a world of connection that was otherwise impossible. This was her first true act of rebellion, a quiet but determined claim to her own identity. Online, she could be anyone she wanted. She wasn't the sick girl in the wheelchair. She was a healthy, vibrant young woman looking for love, and she posted pictures of herself standing and walking, a self she could only be in secret. This secret life led to her first serious attempt at escape. In 2011, at the age of 19, Gypsy attended a science fiction convention with her mother. There, she met a man and, after communicating with him online for some time, ran away with him to his hotel room. It was a clumsy, desperate bid for freedom. Dee Dee, discovering her daughter gone, went into a panic. She used their shared computer to track down the man's information and called him, threatening to call the police and report him for statutory rape, as she had convinced everyone, including Gypsy herself at times, that Gypsy was a minor. The man, terrified, brought Gypsy back. The punishment for this transgression was brutal and absolute. According to Gypsy, Dee flew into a rage. She smashed the computer with a hammer. She tied Gypsy to the bed by her wrists and ankles for 2 weeks, allowing her up only to use the bathroom. She threatened to report to the police that Gypsy was mentally incompetent, ensuring that she would never be seen as a credible adult, that her words would never hold weight against her mother's. The message was clear. This failed attempt was a pivotal moment. It likely solidified in Gypsy's mind that she could never simply walk away. Her mother's control was too absolute. Any attempt to leave would be framed as the act of a mentally deficient child, and the world would believe her mother, as it always had. Trapped and terrified, Gypsy retreated deeper into her online world. It was her only remaining sanctuary. In 2012, through a Christian dating website, she met Nicholas Gojan. He lived in Big Bend, Wisconsin, and was a few years older than her. Their relationship blossomed in the clandestine world of private messages and late-night video chats. To Gypsy, Nick was a Prince Charming who promised to rescue her from her tower. He listened to her, he validated her, and he believed her story of abuse. To Nick, Gypsy was a damsel in distress, a pure and innocent soul who needed his protection. Nicholas Gojan had his own set of significant challenges. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and displayed signs of other mental health issues, which he would later describe as dissociative identity disorder, claiming to have multiple personalities or alters. He had a criminal history, including a 2013 charge for indecent exposure after being caught masturbating while looking at pornography on a computer at a McDonald's. His own online life was a rich fantasy world, a place where he could escape his social anxieties. He and Gypsy quickly developed an intense and elaborate shared fantasy. They role-played constantly, often involving dark, violent, and sexual themes. He had an alter ego named Victor, a 500-year-old vampire, while she had her own personas, like Ruby. Their thousands of text messages, later retrieved by investigators, reveal a chilling blend of childlike romance and cold-blooded planning. They referred to each other as husband and wife, discussed their future children, and dreamed of a simple life together. Interspersed with these domestic fantasies were graphic sexual messages and, eventually, practical discussions about murder. As Gypsy's desperation grew, she began to believe that the only way she would ever be truly free from her mother was if her mother was gone, permanently. By both her and Gojan's accounts, she was the one who first raised the idea of killing Dee. She saw it as a desperate, last-resort solution to an unbearable life of imprisonment. Gojan, in his self-appointed role as her devoted night and dark protector, readily agreed. He saw it as his duty, a necessary evil to save the woman he loved. They were two damaged people, living in a world of fantasy, who began plotting a very real and violent crime. On the night of June 9, 2015, after months of planning, Nicholas Gojan arrived in Springfield, Missouri, by bus. He carried a backpack containing a knife he had purchased for the occasion. He checked into a local Days Inn motel and waited for Gypsy's signal. The final instructions came via text message. Wait until Dee was asleep. Around 3 in the morning, Gojan walked the 1.5 miles from his motel to the small pink house on West Volunteer Way. The neighborhood was silent. Gypsy, who had been waiting, let him inside. She provided him with the knife, a pair of blue latex gloves, and duct tape. Then, as they had planned, she retreated to the bathroom, covering her ears to muffle the sounds of what was to come. According to Gojan's detailed confession, he entered Dee's bedroom where she was sleeping on her back. He stood over her for a few moments, then climbed on top of her and began to stab her. She woke up and began to scream, not for help, but for Gypsy. "Gypsy!" she cried out. Gojan described holding her down and continuing the attack, stabbing her again and again until she was silent. He had inflicted 17 stab wounds, mostly to her back and the back of her neck, a brutal attack that pathologists would later describe as an expression of rage. After the murder, he found Gypsy in the bathroom. They had sex in Gypsy's bedroom, an act they would later describe as a way of consummating their new freedom. They then attempted a hasty cleanup of the blood, took approximately $4,000 that Dee Dee had saved in a safe, and called a cab to take them back to Gojan's motel. From there, they began their journey north by bus, back to Gojan's home in Wisconsin, believing they had committed the perfect crime and were on their way to a life of happily ever after. For the next few days, they existed in a state of surreal denial. They behaved like any young couple in love, celebrating their new life together. They went to see the movie Cinderella, went shopping at Walmart, and planned their future. In a bizarre and ultimately incriminating move, they mailed the murder weapon and the gloves back to Gojan's address in Wisconsin, wanting to keep the knife as a macabre souvenir of their shared act. It seemed they inhabited a world detached from the horrific violence they had unleashed, as if the murder was merely a plot point in their ongoing fantasy. But the real world was about to come crashing down. Back in Springfield, concern was growing among Dee Dee's friends. They hadn't heard from her in days, which was highly unusual. It was this growing concern that prompted Gypsy to make the fateful decision that would unravel their entire plan. From Gojan's home in Wisconsin, using her laptop, Gypsy logged onto the Facebook account she had shared with her mother. She later claimed her motive was to accelerate the discovery of her mother's body. Fearing it would begin to decompose, she wanted her mother found, wanted the world to know she was dead, so she could finally be free. So she typed the now infamous words, "That bitch is dead." The post immediately triggered alarm. When the second, more graphic comment followed, detailing a supposed rape and murder, friends knew something was terribly wrong and called the police. This digital cry for attention was the beginning of the end. The Greene County Sheriff's Office began its investigation, and the scene at the house was perplexing. There was no sign of forced entry. Valuables, aside from the cash, seemed untouched. The primary mystery was the whereabouts of Gypsy Rose. The initial narrative was of a vulnerable, disabled girl abducted by a killer, but investigators were already uncovering inconsistencies. A search of the home revealed that Gypsy's multiple wheelchairs and oxygen tanks were still there. More importantly, they found medical paperwork that hinted at the long-running fraud. One doctor's note explicitly suggested that Dee Dee might be suffering from Munchausen by proxy. The most stunning discovery was Gypsy's birth certificate. It listed her birth year as 1991, not 1995 as her mother had always claimed, making her a 23-year-old woman, not a 19-year-old teenager. The crucial break in the case came from the Facebook posts. Digital forensics experts from the FBI quickly traced the IP address of the posts to a location in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The address belonged to Nicholas Gojan. When local law enforcement in Waukesha County executed a search warrant on the Gojan residence on June 15th, they found Nick and Gypsy inside. To their astonishment, Gypsy was not in a wheelchair. She was standing in the hallway, walking on her own 2 feet, perfectly healthy and by all appearances unharmed. When questioned, they both surrendered peacefully and quickly confessed to the entire plot. The interrogation footage is staggering. Gypsy, speaking in her usual high-pitched, childlike voice, calmly lays out the decades of abuse. She details the fake illnesses, the unnecessary surgeries, the physical and psychological torment. She explains that she saw no other way out. For the investigators, and soon for the entire world, the shocking truth was revealed. The victim of the abduction was, in fact, the mastermind of the murder. The helpless invalid was a desperate prisoner who had orchestrated a bloody escape. The heartwarming story of the devoted mother and sick child dissolved, replaced by a much darker and more complex tale of abuse, manipulation, and matricide. The legal system was now faced with a case of extraordinary complexity. The prosecutor for Greene County, Dan Patterson, acknowledged it was one of the most unusual and tragic cases he had ever encountered. On one hand, he had a clear case of first-degree murder, meticulously planned over a long period. On the other, he had a defendant in Gypsy, who was the victim of one of the most severe and prolonged cases of child abuse imaginable. Gypsy's defense attorney, Michael Stanfield, argued that her entire life had been a prison, and her actions were a direct result of the relentless abuse. He portrayed her as a young woman with the emotional and social development of a child, brainwashed by her mother into a state of learned helplessness. The abuse, he argued, was a profound mitigating factor that needed to be considered. To many in the public, Gypsy's actions were the predictable, if tragic, outcome of a desperate situation she did not create. Faced with the possibility of a first-degree murder charge and a life sentence without parole, Gypsy Rose Blanchard accepted a plea deal. In July 2016, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was a remarkably lenient sentence for the crime, a clear acknowledgement by the legal system of the extreme circumstances that drove her to it. In a strange and tragic irony, for the first time in her life, Gypsy was truly free. In prison, she would later say, she felt more liberated than she ever had while living with her mother. The fate of Nicholas Godejohn was far harsher. His defense team argued that his autism spectrum disorder and other mental health issues made him highly susceptible to manipulation. They claimed he was Gypsy's pawn, a troubled young man who had been drawn into her desperate plan because of his social deficits and his overwhelming desire to be her heroic savior. The prosecution, however, painted him as a willing and violent participant, a man with his own dark fantasies who was looking for an excuse to act on them. They pointed to the brutality of the murder itself as evidence that he was more than just a reluctant tool. In February 2019, after a trial in which his detailed confession was the primary evidence, a jury found Nicholas Godejohn guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Two people, bound together by a shared fantasy, had conspired to commit one crime, but the system judged their culpability and their futures very differently. In December of 2023, after serving 8.5 years of her 10-year sentence, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released from prison on parole. She emerged into a world she had only ever experienced through a computer screen, a world that was now obsessed with her story. She is a free woman, but the psychological scars of her upbringing will undoubtedly remain for a lifetime. Nicholas Godejohn remains in prison, serving a life sentence, forever the dark night in a fairy tale that ended in a blood-soaked bedroom. The little pink house on West Volunteer Way, a monument to a terrible secret, was eventually repainted a neutral gray, and then, in 2019, it was torn down, an attempt to erase the physical reminder of the dark secrets it held. The story endures, a cautionary tale about the monstrous nature of deception. The central tragedy of this case is not just the murder of a woman, but the theft of a childhood, the complete annihilation of a young girl's identity, for the sake of her mother's psychological needs. D.D. Blanchard built a prison for her daughter out of wheelchairs, prescriptions, and lies. She crafted a perfect illusion of love that was, in reality, a lifelong act of suffocation. In the end, the only tool her daughter believed she had to break free was the one that would destroy them both. The most terrifying prisons are not the ones with iron bars, but the ones built by the people who convince us they are keeping us safe. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.